Speedrunning is defined as the act of completing any given action in the fastest possible time. This term has originated and simultaneously become more popular in the past couple of decades, mainly due to video games. I'm sure most of you have seen or at the very least attempted a speedrun of some kind, whether it was done by watching professional players running popular games like Super Mario 64 or Minecraft, or by playing different games whose main goal consisted of completing certain sections as quickly as you could, like Trackmania for example. Needless to say, speedrunning has become an important part of video games as a whole, with thousands of runs being submitted to speedrun.com, the biggest speedrunning website, every single day. But the run I'm here to talk about isn't actually listed on this website. In fact, I don't think anyone has ever covered any major content related to this game at all. Which is why I figured I'd shed some light on it, since it has one of the most phenomenal speedrun communities I have ever encountered. A group of players who have pushed the absolute limit to try and perfect what I'd argue to be one of the most astonishing speedruns of all time. So, without further ado, welcome to Ball Jump. On January 9th, 2020, a mysterious team by the name of Tiramisu Leka would upload a seemingly normal game to the popular coding website Scratch. At first, this seemed like a rather simple creation, with its description reading as follows. This is our first game, and we're proud to have finished it relatively quickly. Controls are in the game, have fun. Pressing the start button would greet you with a menu and two different options, start game and controls. Speaking of those, they were actually quite simple, with only 4 inputs being required in total. The left and right arrows were used to move, the up arrow to jump, and G to give up and end the game. It also warns us to stay away from birds and aliens, as they could potentially kill you, so it might be best to keep track of those. Oh yeah, there's also an Easter egg on the bottom right corner that gives you a silly pop-up message when you click on it. Pretty neat feature if you ask me. Finally though, we have no other choice but to get ourselves started, and this is what awaits us. So, this game works as follows. The player is a ball that can both move around and, well, jump. The ball can get on top of platforms as well as collect coins along the way, which don't actually change much besides the score indicator. There's actually many different screens until you eventually reach the end, with each of them having their own speedrun tricks and gimmicks, but we'll get to that part in a bit. After the ball gets past the first screen in what seems to be a grassy area, they eventually make their way into the sky, where if they don't manage to land on a platform, they'll be sent back to the very start, and on screen 3, we finally get to meet the first opponent, the bird. These birds travel back and forth in a constant loop, and will immediately kill the player if they come into contact with them. You're then met with another bird on screen 4, and by screen 5, you have officially made it to what is considered to be the space zone. A couple screens later, you eventually come across the second threat in this game, aliens. They work pretty similarly to the birds, only this time having a different character sprite, but still keeping the same script as the previous enemy. And just like the birds, you end up finding a second alien on the following level, and if you manage to make it to screen 9 without failing a single jump, you win. All in all, Ball Jump is a pretty solid first game from an indie team, having a challenging but rewarding gameplay cycle that doesn't feel too repetitive. But I'm pretty sure most of you were left wondering, Perix, have you gone insane? Why the fuck are you covering this game? How can a simple game like this have such an insane speedrun history? Well, let's just say that the people who picked up on this game were determined to see it being completed as quickly as possible. And the rest is history. Shortly after Ball Jump was released to the public, a fellow player by the name of TYHL decided to give it a shot, and after enough attempts, they ended up submitting what might just be the earliest evidence of a speedrun for this game, leaving a comment that quotes, "Pretty fun game overall. Tried to beat it as fast as possible, and I got a 113 after a while." There is unfortunately no evidence to back this comment, but judging by how much faster the following verified times were, I think it's safe to assume that this was done legitimately at some point at the start of 2020. Since there's no footage to demonstrate how the run turned out, I can only assume that it was done pretty casually and without any major skips. But we wouldn't have to wait too long before another runner joined the speedrun scene, this time with actual footage to back themselves. The runner's name was Baseduck. Baseduck was the first ever speedrunner to submit a video of his best time, that being a 1:05 on the 26th of January 2020. The run was still pretty bare bones from what was to come, but a lot of skill could be demonstrated nonetheless. They started off strong during the first few screens, and while they did bleed out a good bit of time because of the bird and alien cycles, they still managed to keep the run going until the very end, claiming the current world record at the time. They also started the timer as they pressed the play button, which is something to keep in mind given how the following runs would have a different way of initiating themselves. But it wouldn't take too long until another runner would snipe the record away from Baseduck, and that's exactly what player Ether95 did just 3 days after the record was uploaded. Ether demolished the previous time with a whopping 43-second run, becoming the world's first sub 1 minute speedrun in ball jump history, and they were also the first runner to ever implement proper strategies to save time. For starters, Ether began by starting the timer as he pressed the jump bind for the first time, which would soon become the main strategy for how speedrunners started their runs. It's nothing major, but still worth noting down, as it did save a tiny bit of time. They also decided to use a technique called wedge jumping, where they would jump from the underside of a platform as a way to gain additional upwards momentum, since pressing jump while on the platform would force you up until you were out of it. Aside from getting pretty bad RNG with the enemies once again, Ether managed to finish the run and comfortably claim a spot as the world record holder on January 29th. And that's where the record stood for the next couple of months, as the game's release went under the radar for most users. But all of that would change in May of 2020, when the game would finally receive its deserved place in the spotlight. On the 25th of May, a niche speedrun content creator by the name of Taboa1 would upload a new video to his channel, speedrunning scratch games you've never heard of. Although it had the pretty simple concept, the video ended up receiving an overwhelming amount of support, gaining over 20,000 views in under 24 hours and allowing the otherwise unpopular scratch games to be checked out by those curious to see how far Taboa's records could be pushed. But among every game that he decided to play in the video, a single one stood out among the rest, and I'm sure you can guess which one it was.
I think roguelite has a lot of potential, but for this next game I can definitely say that it's really good. It's called Ball Jump, and I know it might not look like much at first, but the gameplay loop is really fun and replayable, and it's just the perfect game to scratch that speedrunning itch.
Within a matter of days, dozens of people decided to check out Ball Jump with the sole intent of trying to beat it as quickly as possible, and it didn't take long before Ether's record was shattered by a new player, this time with a completely different strategy from anything we had previously seen. This was Slice Bamboo.
Wait, shit, I actually got it.
Bamboo started her run as normal, but as soon as she got to screen 2, she did this. This was the back and forth strat, where by continuously jumping off of platform's ledges, you would completely skip having to wait to fall on them. This wasn't just applicable on screen 2 though, because she immediately used the same strat on screens 3 and 6, shaving off a couple extra seconds with each back and forth skip. Using these new strats, Bamboo managed to set a new world record of 39 seconds on May 26th, breaking yet another 10-second barrier. She even managed to lower it by a second on the very next day, becoming the first runner to ever set 2 world records back to back. But it wouldn't take long before another runner found yet another way to save even more time. See, aside from Bamboo on screen 3, most runners had been struggling with the bird and alien RNG, having to spend a couple seconds for a decent cycle to keep going. And that's where a brand new runner came in, and his name was Laserpixel. Laserpixel found out that the code of both the birds and the aliens had an internal cycle that started the moment the player pressed play, allowing for said player to pretty much control the enemy's movement cycle by simply waiting for the perfect time gap without starting the run. He eventually came to the conclusion that the best possible time window to start the speedrun would be at about 6 seconds after pressing play, as that would give you a comfortable cycle for the first and second birth, and while the aliens would still be a bit tricky, it wouldn't bleed out as much time as the previous runs. With that knowledge in mind, LaserPixel decided to do some attempts of his own, and just after a couple of hours, he managed to set a brand new world record of 35 seconds, the same day Bamboo set her previous personal best. He also found out that you could use the back and forth strat on the very first screen, which helped cut the time a little bit. But progress wouldn't slow down anytime soon, as the newly found speedrun community immediately began researching to try and find the fastest optimal path, and what they found was astonishing. A few days went by after LaserPixel's record, and players wanted to try and see if they could push ball jump speedrunning to its absolute limit. But most of the screens had already been maxed out, with 4 out of 8 screens using the back and forth strat to fully perfect that segment. But players knew that there were still ways to save time, and on May 31st, a relatively new user by the name of Frailty89 joined the newly found speedrun Discord server and immediately made a post discussing what would eventually become a crucial time save in the current run. This was the Screen 1 ledge grab. Upon starting a run, most players would begin by jumping on the left side of the screen and doing a back and forth jump all the way to Screen 2, but Frailty suggested that a potentially faster route could be achieved. When jumping on the third platform of the screen, instead of making your way to the right and into the fourth slab, you could instead hold the jump bind and barely manage to squeeze into the lower end of the last platform, immediately pushing you into Screen 2. Players were shocked by this discovery, as it did turn out to be slightly faster than the original strategy that LaserPixel had used in his world record, and his run would quickly become second place as a new runner would finally take the number 1 spot. This was Nata.
That's it. Okay.
Nata had been running the game for a couple of days, managing to finish pretty good runs in under 45 seconds, but he had never had the chance to claim a record of his own, though that quickly changed as he immediately began grinding the new strat, resetting dozens upon dozens of times and eventually managing to finish a run with a whopping time of 32 seconds, granting them a record that seemed like the closest we'd ever had to a perfect run. And then a few days went by, days that eventually turned into weeks, and soon enough, all of the progress that had been made up until then ended up coming to a halt. Realistically though, 4 out of the 8 screens in the game had already been perfected, and it was almost safe to assume that Nata's run could be regarded as ball jump's human limit. There wasn't any time left to save at this point. How could the run potentially get any faster? Well, it turns out that after so many weeks, a certain runner was still determined to get the best possible time in ball jump's history, a time so good that it would remain world record for years to come, and they weren't going to let anything stop them. But before we look into how such a run could be achieved, it's best if we go back into analyzing specific segments of the game, mainly Screen 5, which was highly regarded to be one of the most awkward screens at the time. Screen 5 was commonly regarded as the waiting sim, given how after you had made it through the first 3 platforms, the player had to spend a considerable amount of time descending until they successfully landed on the second to last platform. But a theory had been circulating around the Speedrun Discord server for quite some time, titled by many as the human limit skip. This strategy consisted in the player jumping off of the second platform with just enough momentum to make their way to the second to last platform, shaving off the time it would take them to wait for their descent in order to keep going. But there was one major downside with this technique, as nobody had successfully attempted it up until that point, keeping it as a skip that could only be performed with the usage of tools. After the speedrun hype died down, people eventually forgot about this skip, claiming that the fastest possible time had already been set by Nata, and that it would be nearly impossible to find a new route that could potentially save the smallest amount of time. But there was a single runner who never gave up in their quest to claim back the world record they had secretly spent weeks grinding for, and to prove once and for all that the human limit had been made to be broken. A runner that most of you are actually familiar with, and her name was Sliced Bamboo.
Oh shit, I didn't know this was possible. What?
Bamboo had officially done it. Not only had she beaten the so-called perfect world record, becoming the first person to achieve a sub 30 run, but she had also managed to execute the human limit skip in a full run for the very first time in ball jump history, proving everyone who had doubted its viability wrong. And that's where the record stands today, despite it being more than 5 years since it was originally set. The run had finally been maxed out after so many attempts. Well, at least that's what we think. Bamboo's run is the closest we've ever been to witnessing the game's speedrun perfection, but who knows what other skips could still somehow be found after so long. Maybe one day I'll be able to prove my past self wrong when I say that this is the fastest ball jump will ever be. But for now, this was the history of ball jump speedrunning. Thanks for watching. But wait, just before the video ends, there's something I've secretly been hiding from you guys, and since you made it to the very end, I think it's fair to let you know that everything you have seen in this video up until now is completely made up. Yup, I'm serious. If it wasn't obvious enough, everything I've talked about aside from the actual game itself was all a work of unfiction. A way of storytelling that bases itself off of events that never actually happened in the first place. I was first introduced to this concept by popular YouTuber Sig and Hawks, in a video where he quote-unquote found an old dinosaur horror game that was thought to be lost media. Except that the entire thing was actually made by him from scratch, making for a pretty interesting video despite having a fake narrative. See, Ball Jump was an actual game made by my girlfriend over half a decade ago, and once she showed it to me, I was curious to see what would happen if a bunch of speedrunners attempted to give it a shot. And let's just say I might have gotten a little carried away. I then proceeded to handcraft background footage, speedruns, strategies, and even go as far as to create custom profiles and Discord messages to add more realism to the whole thing. But hold on a second. Not everything aside from the game is 100% fake, as I did have a few of my friends help me out with giving some of the characters more authenticity. I'd like to thank Taboa1 for voicing himself for the imaginary YouTube video, LaserPixel for letting me use his name and profile picture, as well as Nata and Sliced Bamboo, who's actually my girlfriend, for also voicing themselves as speedrunners getting a record. As always though, I'd like to thank you for watching until the very end. I tried drifting away from my usual topics to try and make something I enjoyed, and I must say, it was a blast to create such a complex story out of a pretty simple game. Don't expect me to make a lot of these though, just a heads up. But with all of that said, this was the most underrated speedrun you've never heard of. Hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I did making it, and until next time, see ya!